Republican Senator from Missouri, Roy Blunt, announced yesterday that he will retire and not seek re-election.
So it was interesting. Friend of our show, Ryan Gardusky, said that his retirement marks 5 open Senate seats for the GOP. It presents a serious opportunity to rebuild the Republican Party, if that's what some people want. Democratic strategist and owner of JC Strategies, Jennifer Holsworth-Karp, and Senior Director of Policy, Rachel Bovard, they join us now to discuss. Rachel, let me start with you from this perspective, and Ryan's in particular. 5 open GOP Senate seats. How does that play out in terms of battles within the party? You're obviously involved within the movement as well. How are people vetting and looking at who are the people who are likely to run? And in terms of how the party and Mitch McConnell and other interested parties are thinking about it, what are they thinking in terms of recruiting candidates for these seats?
Well, this is going to be, I think, where the divide in the GOP shows itself, because there are people who just want to protect the seats and people who want good candidates in those seats, winning elections that more reflect, I think, where the Republican Party should be going or where we want it to go. And that's going to be the big test, because we have always deferred these kind of Senate candidate selections to people like Mitch McConnell, his team, Senate Leadership Fund, and they failed in a lot of ways. I mean, McConnell's picks lost. In Georgia, they lost in Arizona. He backed a bunch of losers in the 2010 cycle. And so I think if the party is serious about, changing its focus, about responding to the newly constructed base that Trump left us, there has to be way more people in the room picking these candidates. And I think he should outsource some of that decisions to the new leadership in the Republican Party, the younger guys who, are dynamic and winning elections statewide. So it can't be just Mitch McConnell in a room by himself.
Yeah. I mean, the problem, Jen, for the Republican Party is they are not about anything other than just like fealty to Trump and who will go the farthest on stop the steal. That's where the energy and the base is. It has nothing to do at this point, really, with policy. It's like Dr. Seuss and stop the steal. So whoever is willing to go the furthest down on a limb is the one ultimately who's going to win the Republican primary. Do you think that creates some, first of all, do you agree with that? And second of all, do you think that creates some opportunities for Democrats in states that maybe shouldn't be on the board for them?
I completely agree with that. In fact, you pretty much took the words out of my mouth. I mean, I think in my mind, and I'm being a little bit Pollyanna about this, but this is an opportunity for the Republican Party to remake themselves away from Donald Trump. I think that they should spend resources sort of organizing independence, which the Democratic Party is not doing a very good job organizing right now, even though we took back the White House. So, if I'm taking my Democrat hat off for a minute, this is an opportunity for them to actually get away from the newly constructed base that Donald Trump left them, because they are loyal to one thing and one thing only, and that is Donald Trump. Do I think it presents opportunity for Democrats? Absolutely. But I think that you're going to see some very interesting challenges during the primary. It is the same sort of play that has been happening over and over since 2016. Do we put up a progressive candidate and, sort of let them go into the general, which hasn't really happened yet in a Senate race? Or, do we put up somebody who's this more moderate type construction and what a lot of people refer to as sort of an establishment candidate in order to appeal to the moderate center in some of these states that are going to be exceedingly difficult? Ohio has trended unbelievably red over the last decade. You've got an interesting race in Pennsylvania already shaping up between Fetterman and Malcolm Kenyatta. You've got a very interesting electorate left in North Carolina after 2016 in 2020. I don't really have any hopes about Alabama, but we'll see. And then you've got a couple of people saying that they're not going to run in Missouri, well-known people. So Claire McCaskill and Jason Kander both yesterday came out and said they are absolutely not going to run. So, I think that it's wide open here. I think the Democrats have an opportunity to definitely pick up some seats. I don't know how easy it's going to be with the base that Trump left behind on the Republican side.
So, yeah, Rachel, respond to that, actually. I'm pretty curious in terms of, do you think that this was the problem in Georgia? There were a lot of problems in Georgia, obviously, the $2,000 checks being one, but the Trump people not coming out was a second one, too. How is it going to fare when Trump himself's not on the ballot? Like, in terms of 2018, there was some success in driving out voters in red states, but in more blue areas, he was basically overwhelmed by that surge. What does that look like in a 2022 environment, the issue set, all of that?
Well, I reject this notion that this is just about Trump and it's just about a loyalty to a person. That is very much an element, I think, of what made Trump successful. But I do think there's a lot of candidates and a lot of people in the Republican Party working to take it beyond Trump. Whether we get there or not is an open question. But, I think the mainstream media did this terrible job of just calling everyone in the Republican Party racist and overlooking a lot of actually the intellectual work that's going on in the Republican Party. And I think you're going to see some of the candidates start to reflect that. And these primaries are going to be bloody. I think that's the biggest risk for the Republican Party, to be honest, is the two poles of the party going out to war with each other. Because in those situations, they almost knock each other out, and some rando wins the primary. And then that's what makes Republicans lose. But for instance, Ohio, I think you're going to see some new candidates that announcing soon that represent sort of this new sort of intellectual force of the Republican Party. And so whether or not that is successful, this is the test for the Republican Party. Trump will always be there, but I think his light is going to fade as new stars come around who can speak to the issues in a very intelligent and policy specific way that Trump couldn't do.
I hope it works.
Maybe. Look, I think Trump had a chance to do all of those things and make Trumpism about something other than himself as a person. He chose not to do that. You can see who he made his loyalists. They're all over the ideological map. Some of them, there's like Ron Johnson, who's total polar opposite, or Jerry Moran, as Sagar was pointing out. Jen, one thing I wanted to point out in your analysis about the Democratic primaries that I think it's worth noting, you mentioned Ohio, and you mentioned Pennsylvania, states where you kind of need a candidate to appeal to that moderate center. The one Democrat who's elected statewide in Ohio is Sherrod Brown. In Pennsylvania, Fetterman, who's the more leftist candidate, is already elected statewide. So I think some of that conventional wisdom doesn't necessarily apply. Although what I would say, I wish that these primaries and I wish that the general elections were ultimately about ideology. I think the primaries oftentimes are. General elections are mostly about sort of partisan loyalties and what the national winds, which way the national winds are ultimately blowing in. Are Democrats, do you think, concerned about the midterms? Because on the one hand, Sagar and I were actually debating some of this today. On the one hand, Biden's really popular. He's doing a good job with the vaccines. He got a relief bill out that's really broadly popular. On the other hand, just historically, midterms normally go terribly for the party that's in power. Democrats would have to match the best performance in the past 40 years, which was in 2002 with Republicans, in order just to hold on to their majorities. Do you think that there's a sense of concern and urgency around that very difficult mission that Democrats have right now to essentially buck history and do well in these midterms?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. I may have to eat crow in November of 2022, but right now I think we lose both the House and the Senate in 2022, just based on historic patterns. I think it would take some phenomenal headwinds and some unbelievable wins by the Biden administration in order to prevent that from happening. And that's actually not a reflection on President Biden. I think what you're saying is true. If he keeps up this sort of consistent approval rating and, wins that show actual help to people across the country, like the stimulus bill, like the vaccine program, and hopefully a couple of other legislative wins before we head into 2022, I think that it's not going to be a referendum on the Biden presidency. But one thing that I will give the conservative media is that they are much better at delivering a consistent message to their voters in order to turn them out. It is still World War III on the conservative blogs in terms of stop the steal. He's still trying to motivate, and I say he, meaning Donald Trump, but it is a group of people on the right who are ginning up people all over the country in order to come out for the midterms. And unless Democrats put on a united front full of actual promises that they have delivered on, then I think we're going to have a big problem. I still unfortunately see this battle happening in the primaries, which leads into the general, which always puts us at a disadvantage. So I will say, as of right this moment, I think we lose both unless some significant changes are made in terms of messaging and how we deliver that message.
Yeah, really interesting analysis, guys. All right, thank you. Appreciate it. Next on Rising, Biden's labor official is a union-crushing lobbyist from the Obama era, Edward Onweso. He's going to discuss his backstory with Uber workers when Rising continues.